They launched this surprise offensive. They regained the momentum. Everybody's talking about the Kursk offensive. And it shattered the myth of Russian invincibility. And I think that was really important.
Now, it's 6 months since Ukrainian forces stunned Vladimir Putin and, let's be honest, Ukraine's own allies by storming across the frontier in a surprise counter-offensive that smashed into Russia's Kursk region. Well, the Ukrainians claimed this week that Russia had lost some 40,000 troops in Kursk, the Kremlin having to bring in around 12,000 North Korean troops to help it try and push the Ukrainian army out of Russian territory. But after losing some 4,000 dead and wounded, the Korean troops were withdrawn from the front. So 6 months since that counteroffensive begun, Ukraine is holding on in Kursk, although it's lost around half of the 1,000 square kilometres it originally seized. What happens next? Jerome Starkey has reported from that region, the Sun's defence editor, who's in the studio with me. Jerome, good afternoon.
Hi, Rosie.
Remind us what you found when you went and reported there.
Well, we managed to go in August, and that was quite soon after that offensive had started. And what we saw was a town abandoned. We made it to Sudzha, which remains the largest town that Ukraine captured, and they still hold it. Although I'm sad to say that that town has faced sort of ever-increasing bombardment since we left. Even when we were there, we could hear the constant thud of artillery. Just this week, a dormitory, a school, which the Ukrainians had turned into a shelter for some of those civilians who'd been left behind, was really badly damaged. Ukraine blaming Russia. Russia, I think, quite incredibly blaming Ukraine for this, but 4 people killed in that shelter. There were some 84 people in the building, and that was because most of the town had been abandoned. So that was a shelter just for the people who couldn't flee, and the people who couldn't flee were the old and the frail and the poor and the weak, the people who didn't have vehicles or couldn't get to a bus station to drive themselves out as Ukraine made that lightning advance.
It was lightning. They've lost some of that ground. And explain to us the significance of it, because if what we're expecting next week, Donald Trump lays out his potential proposal for what peace might look like, this region in Kursk, any territory that Ukraine currently holds that was Russia's, presumably is their biggest chip in any negotiation.
And perhaps that is the main reason for this. At the time, Ukraine had been responding to Russian attacks since October 2023. So if we just remember where we were in August when they launched this attack, Ukraine was effectively in a protracted state of losing the war. It was soaking up punches, but every time it soaked up a punch, it ceded ground. And we'd seen them lose Avdiivka at the beginning of last year. And then suddenly in August, they launched this surprise offensive. They regained the momentum. Everybody's talking about the Kursk offensive. And it shattered the myth of Russian invincibility. And I think that was really important because the longer it goes with Russia slowly grinding forward, Ukraine's allies, and perhaps even some people in Ukraine, but particularly people outside Ukraine, seem to revert to, and I think it is a myth, of Russian invincibility. They think Russia's victory is inevitable, and I don't think that's the case. So the first thing that offensive achieved was to shatter that myth. The second thing it achieved, as you rightly point out, was Ukraine seized a bargaining chip. They have a sovereign piece of Russian soil. They inflicted on Russia the worst loss of home soil since the end of the Second World War. And they made quite clear quite quickly they had no ambitions to hold on to this territory beyond the conflict. They weren't planning to annex it, to make it part of Ukraine, as Russia has done with some of the territory it has captured in the south and east of Ukraine. President Zelensky's been talking about it recently to mark the 6-month anniversary, and he talked about 2 other functions as well. He said that it prevented Russia from launching an offensive on that northern front. So we'd seen them launch a little foray into Kharkiv not long before the Kursk offensive. So he suggested that by Ukraine taking the initiative, they thwarted Russian plans to open a new front. And of course, the other thing it did is it tied up Russian forces, some of Russia's most experienced or trained forces, including Marines and paratroopers. It tied them up in Kursk, which meant that they weren't available to prosecute the offensives around the eastern Donbass front. And that's really important because Ukraine has lost ground in the east. Had it not done this Kursk offensive, one can only imagine that it might have lost more ground, or it might have lost ground more quickly.
And then, of course, we reported on extensively at the time, Russia then recruit troops from North Korea because they need to have bolstered support in Kursk. Tell us why it is that those Korean troops have now been withdrawn.
Conflicting reports about this, but Ukrainian forces who've been fighting in Kursk said last week that for about 3 weeks they hadn't seen the North Koreans on the line, and the suggestion was that they had been withdrawn because they had suffered such high levels of casualties, because within a few weeks of deploying, around 1 in 3, 4,000 out of 12,000 North Korean troops had either been killed or injured. It's not clear whether they've withdrawn to regroup and those same troops, or rather the survivors, are planning to come back to the front line, or perhaps that entire rotation of some 12,000 North Koreans may be rotated out, and we may expect to see more coming in from North Korea. Zelensky has said, up to about 25,000, 25 to 40,000, I think are the numbers he's given, of North Koreans may be coming to fight in Russia. North Korea's involvement in the conflict is interesting. It's not tipping the balance one way or another. I mean, for most of the time that those North Koreans have been in Kursk, Russia has been losing between 1,000 and 1,500 soldiers a day, both dead and injured. But the last few months have been the bloodiest of the conflict for Russia. And so in many ways, whilst 12,000 North Koreans sounds like a lot of personnel, and it's a huge commitment for a country that hasn't fought a hot war for over half a century to send to fight in a neighbour's conflict, a conflict which isn't their own, nonetheless, it's less than 2 weeks' supply of soldiers for Russia.
You talk about how it's been the bloodiest in the last couple of months or so. What are you anticipating President Trump is going to say next week, and how that might actually change the status of this war?
Well, the suggestions that Donald Trump or his envoys may be planning to release details of their peace plan, possibly at the Munich Security Conference, which takes place at the end of next week. Leaked reports suggesting there are 3 parts to it. There aren't any great surprises as far as I can see. I mean, the first part is freezing the front lines. We've heard that from Trump's camp already. The second part is...
people would have the territory that they had right now?
So, exactly. Freeze it where it is right now. Now, whether that is, for the time being, a ceasefire now to enable ongoing talks, or whether that becomes a calcified front line, we don't know. Enforce a buffer zone, a no-fire zone, with foreign forces, likely European and United Kingdom. Trump's been very clear he has no intention of seeing American forces going into Ukraine. And the third part, which I think is, for you, certainly from Ukraine's point of view, the most controversial, although none of this makes particularly happy reading for Ukraine, the third part is that Ukraine is banned from joining NATO and must remain neutral. That would appease Russia. Russia started this war because they were uncomfortable with Ukraine looking towards Europe, wanting to integrate with the European Union, wanting to look west rather than look east. So Vladimir Putin, one would assume, would be happy with much of what is being proposed. He wouldn't have all of the territory necessarily that he wants, because he still hasn't captured all of Donbass, which was his minimalist objectives, the minimum requirement for this conflict. Of course, remember, he thought this was going to be a 3-day war. He thought he'd capture Kyiv and the government
quite incredible
would fall.
In hindsight. We'll hear more from President Trump next week at that security summit. In the meantime, Jerome, I just want to finish by asking you sort of what the last week's been like for you personally. For anyone who doesn't know, Russia issued an arrest warrant out for Jerome because of your reporting largely in Kursk, the region we've just been talking about. What does that mean that life looks like for you over the last sort of week or so? Precaution, without obviously revealing everything, precautions you've had to put in place. How's it impacted your reporting?
It's been a real whirlwind. It's kind of surreal to find yourself on a Russian wanted list. And in one sense, it makes no difference day to day to how I do my job, because I continue to report on and about Ukraine. And in time, I will go back to Ukraine and report from Ukraine. Of course, it does raise questions about how Russia might want to try and implement this. And at the sort of far end of paranoia, you can't help thinking about the things that Russia has done to its enemies in Britain before. I mean, it's poisoned people in this country with polonium, Alexander Litvinenko. It's tried to murder the Skripals with Novichok nerve agent, and it's shot its enemies in Europe. So I honestly do not believe that I am important enough to Russia for them to take those sorts of steps. But I would be lying if I said that, human nature doesn't mean that sometimes you entertain those sort of slightly paranoid, delusional thoughts.
Jerome, thank you so much for speaking so candidly to us here at Times Radio. Jerome Starkey, the Sun's defence editor, on 6 months after that incursion into Russia by Ukrainian troops. Jerome, thank you so much.
Thanks, Rose.